Okay, Chapter 9, The Worlds of Islam. Section 2, The Making of an Arab Empire. In this particular section, we're going to look at gender roles and their different experiences, as well as the split between Sunni and Shia Muslims. And some things I want you to keep in mind. Don't be afraid to explore beyond what's in this textbook, the causes of the division between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Exploring the 7th century causes of this division could help you better understand and grasp the connections to 21st century conflicts within the Islamic world. And you may have preconceived notions of Islam's gender roles. And because of this, it's important to understand the diversity of gender experiences throughout the Islamic world. Make conclusions about how gender roles changed or stayed the same. And just like other topics in this course, try and stay away from judgments when you analyze the Islamic world, not out of concern for political correctness, but judgments more often than not can can foster a shallow or weak analysis. So keep that in mind. Okay, the making of an Arab empire. Here we go. Now, the Arab state grew to include all or part of Egyptian, Roman, Byzantine, Persian, Mesopotamian, and Indian civilizations. Many are both in and out of the Arab Empire converted to Islam. The Arabic culture and language spread widely, and Islam became a new third wave civilization. Let's start with war, conquest, and tolerance. The Arabic conquests were a continuation of a long-term raiding pattern. From the Iberian Peninsula to the Indus River, Muslim armies spread rapidly out of the Arabian Peninsula. They conquered Spain, invaded France in the west. They reached the Indus River Valley in India in the east. And the Arabs invaded and conquered Egypt, wealthy Egypt. And the Persian Sassanid Empire quickly fell, and the Arabs picked up much of the Byzantine territory. There was a new level of political organization that allowed for greater mobilization within those Arab communities. The Byzantine and Persian empires had been weakened by long wars and internal revolts, but there were limits of Arab expansion. Despite, they defeated the Sassanid Empire in the 640s and took half of Byzantium. In the early 700s, they conquered a lot of Spain. Like I said, they attacked France. And they reached the Indus River Valley all the way in India in the east. And by 751, Arabs had crushed a Chinese army at the Battle of Talas River. And in 751, the Islamic forces defeated the Chinese in Central Asia at the Battle of Talas. And this allowed the Turkic people to become a widespread Islamic culture and somewhat checked the westward spread of China. Now, some reasons for their expansion. There are some economic, communal, and religious reasons. Some economic reasons, they captured trade routes and agricultural regions. Individual Arabs sought wealth and social promotion. Their communal reasons, the conquest helped hold the Ummah together. Remember, that's the Islamic community. And their religious regions, they wanted to bring a righteous government to the conquered peoples. And because of the influence of Judaism and Christianity on Muhammad, they were actually very tolerant of the Jewish and Christian faiths. They were granted a special status called Demis, and they were required to pay a tax, the jizya. So, if conversion was encouraged, the empire, like I said, they respected Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians, and they even referred to them as fellow people of the book. These groups were granted this special status, and in lieu of military service, they just had to pay this tax. Now, there were many dhimmi that did serve in the military, but the tolerance allowed these faiths to continue being practiced. Their conquest was actually not too destructive. Arab soldiers were restricted to garrison towns, military towns. The local elites and bureaucracies were often incorporated into the empire as opposed to annihilated. And this map shows you, this is the map that I was talking about in section 1 that shows you the different areas of Islam that were conquered at different times. And you can see here in the dark purple where it all began with Muhammad and his radical new teachings. And you can see that it spreads north, northwest, north, south, east, and northeast. So it spreads in essentially every direction that it can spread. And then from there, it just continues that pattern. Just kind of fanning out, if you will. And eventually, we see by 900, it encompassed a rather large area. And now, up here, the Carolingian Empire, this would be, well, Charlemagne was crowned in the late 700s, and ruled into the early 800s. It gives you kind of an idea. It wasn't until the late 700s or maybe 600s when Western Europe was finally united after the fall of Rome. And so that's why this huge area that was able to was able to conquer and do what they were able to do because of the chaos in Europe. And it became the largest third wave civilization. Okay, let's talk about conversion now. And bear with me, this section is a little long, so bear with me. Now, the initial conversion for many was more of a social conversion as opposed to a deep spiritual change. And Islam had a kinship to Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism that made it attractive. It made it appealing. And from the beginning, Islam was associated with a powerful state. And that suggested that Allah was a good God to have on your side. And it was very appealing. The state provided incentives for conversion. Some of the earliest converts included slaves and prisoners of war. The converts didn't have to pay the jizya, that tax. Islam favored commerce. They obviously had, like we talked about earlier, economic reasons for expanding. And the social climbers were helped by conversion. And while there was obviously many people that were drawn to Islam for spiritual or even psychological reasons, there was a large number that went through a social conversion. And they basically just shifted from one community to another. And the slaves and the prisoners of war and the merchants that were early converts came from the ranks. And they may have been coerced into converting. But like we talked about, there were obvious economic reasons for converting. Avoiding the jizya, that tax, the connections that the merchants could make as part of the Islamic community. And there were some, though, that resisted conversion. The Berbers of North Africa, many of the Spanish Christians, and even some Persian Zoroastrians. But around 80% of the population of Persia converted between 750 and 900. And some areas like Egypt, North Africa, and even Iraq also converted to the Arabic culture and the language. So they completely were engulfed and assimilated into this new civilization. But others like Iran, Turkey, and Pakistan, they have Islamized, but they've done it without Arabizing. Like I said, about 80% had converted to Persia, and Persia and the Turks and the Pakistan, when I say they've Islamized without Arabizing, essentially that means that they took on the religion and but maintain their own cultural identity, their own traditional languages, and other parts of their traditions. They didn't change. Like they didn't they still spoke their own languages and things like that. And the Persian influences on the Islamic world have been immense. Persia, it's a centuries-old empire and civilization. Not only held onto its traditions, but many of them spread into the wider Muslim world. And so that's how strong of an influence Persia had. Persian architecture, administration, and art influenced the culture of the eastern reaches of Islam, which is pretty fascinating considering Islam and Arabic were basically overtaking such a large area, but Persia maintained their language, their culture, and everything. Now let's look at divisions and controversies. There was a central problem when Muhammad died. Who should serve as successor to him? And this was called a caliph. It's the leader. And the first four caliphs were called the rightly guided caliphs, 632 to 661. And they were companions of Muhammad. They had to put down Arab tribal rebellions and new prophets. Uthman and Ali were both assassinated, and there was even a civil war in 656. And the first four caliphs, after the death of Muhammad, there were several disputes that arose who should lead the community. And the first leaders were, like I said, all companions of his. The first caliph had to put down political revolts, new prophets. The third and fourth caliphs were assassinated, right? Uthman and Ali. And thus, within the decades of Muhammad's death, there was a civil war. And it basically threatened to destroy the unity that he built. And the result was a Sunni versus Shia split of Islam. Initially, it was a political dispute over who should rule the Ummah, right, that community. But the Sunni-Shia controversy still divides the Islamic world today. The Shia argue that the leader should come from a direct descendant of Muhammad, while the Sunnis hold that a learned member of the community should be the leader. And there was a lot of persecution of the Shia and several of their leaders, and they developed the ideology of an oppressed minority and came to hold these mystical ideas such as the belief that an assassinated leader had gone into hiding and would return to save the community someday. But a lot of these beliefs and other rituals have developed into a distinct Shia culture. And so they basically identify themselves as opponents of privilege. And this political conflict has thus become religious. The Sunni Muslims were political military leaders and supposed to be chosen by the community. And the Shia Muslims, the leaders should be blood relatives, like descended from Ali and his son Hussein. So you see the difference between the two, and that split still divides Muslims today. And essentially, over time, the caliphs became absolute monarchs. The Umayyad dynasty was a time of great expansion. The Abbasid dynasty eventually overthrew the Umayyads in 750. The Umayyad dynasty, Damascus, which is the capital of Syria. This dynasty, its capital was not in Medina, but in the old Roman and Byzantine city of Damascus. And that provided unity, but soon it faced a series of revolts. The Abbasid, they moved their capital in the ancient Mesopotamian city of Baghdad. They overthrew the Umayyads, and they also faced many revolts themselves before finally falling to the Mongols in 1258. But thus remains the basic religious issue. What does it mean to be a Muslim? Islamic law, known as the Sharia, helped answer that question. And thus there was a reaction against the distraction of worldly success, and they became known as the Sufis. They were mystics who didn't believe that it was necessary to follow the letter of the law, and rather through meditation or ritual, one could have a close spiritual contact with the divine. And Sufis often describe their relationship with the divine as as a form of intoxication or overwhelming love. And so the ulama and Sufism weren't entirely compatible. And a Muslim scholar by the name of Al-Ghazali, he was a legal scholar, but he was a Sufi practitioner, and he was able to develop some type of an agreement or accommodation among these different areas of Islamic thought. And he said that rational philosophy alone couldn't get you to know Allah, nor were revelation and law sufficient. He said that for Muslims, they had to know God in their heart, and that's through that direct personal encounter with Allah. So it was more than the other worldly stuff going on. And so there were a lot of tensions between these two approaches in this religious issue, if you will. Let's talk about women and men in early Islam. Okay, what the rise of Islam meant for women still remains highly controversial. At the spiritual level, the Quran stated explicitly that women and men were equals. But on a social level, the Quran viewed women as subordinate, especially in marriage. And the Quran, albeit women were viewed as subordinate, actually helped women in some ways. It banned female infanticide, which is the killing of female infants, gave women control over their own property, gave women limited rights of inheritance, or granted them limited rights of inheritance, required a woman's consent to a marriage, and it even recognized a woman's right to sexual satisfaction. Some of the social practices of lands where Islam spread were also important in defining women's roles. In early Islam, some women played public roles. They prayed in mosques. They weren't veiled or secluded. And it was really during the time of the revelations that Muhammad created rules that protected women and gave them some control, even the right to divorce. There is a famous passage that allowed Muslim men to have up to 4 wives. Also states that they must all be cared for equally. Spiritually, women who were devout and had good morals would receive Allah's blessing just like a man would. But there were some growing restrictions on women, and these increased over time, especially in the other upper classes under the opposite empire. We see the veiling and seclusion became the standard among the upper ruling classes of the elite women, and this is almost referred to as a golden age for the world of Islam. When the Arab empires were established after Muhammad's death, this is when we see the increased restrictions on elite women. And many of these restrictions, the veiling and the sequestering, were in keeping with the earlier pre-Islamic practices in this part of the world. And so, actually the lower class women didn't have the luxury of seclusion. And these practices were essentially determined by Middle Eastern traditions much more than by the Quran. And so it's difficult and impractical to apply that to lower class women. Women actually were allowed to become hadiths. I messed that up. Women could actually become mullahs. And this was a new religious outlet for women, especially as Sufis, those mystics, and even Shia, the mullahs. The mullahs are like specifically a learned Islamic scholar, I guess, someone who's devoted their life to the religion and understanding all of its parts and even can help others understand it. Hadiths, those are traditions about Muhammad. As time went on, those are what developed a more negative image of women, and that was after his death. Like I said, Muhammad had created those rules that protected women, but after he died, it changed. Things became more restricting for women, and so it's been different. And let's see, we've got one more, and I've got a really good image to show you. This is amazing, I think, because this type of gathering. Look at it. What do you think this gathering is showing in this image? We've got a scene that takes place in a mosque, and you can see the script at the bottom and at the top. You see men praying in one area, right? Women and children playing in another. So you see a seclusion even outside of the home. And closest to the imam on the upper left, that's the religious guy, are old men with gray and white beards. Behind them sit the younger men with dark beards or even no beards at all. Right? You can see. In a separate area below are the women. They're dressed in white as opposed to the colors. Their heads are fully covered except for their eyes. But they are also kneeling in prayer. Their eyes turned up to the imam, right, which you guys can see. And the Arabic writing, I bring that up below the image and at the top, could suggest that this is from a book. It's an illustration from a book. So what does this image suggest about the place of women in Islamic religion and Islamic society? Well, women were segregated in the mosque, but they were not excluded. And the arrangement of the congregation in the mosque reflects the social hierarchy in society. It shows older men being placed above women, yet spiritually both men and women were members of the mosque community. And so it's a matter of debate to what extent women's social inequality affects women's spiritual equality before God. And I think that's a really interesting topic to debate, women's social inequality and how that has affected women's spiritual equality. I think that's very interesting. And that's the end of section 2.